But I've known Erich and through his work at the Wall Street Journal for quite a while. And then when he started writing the book, he contacted me, and I'm sure many others, and was very diligent. We had a very nice Indian lunch, and had a lot of contact. He's done a prodigious amount of work, I have to say, because he went to Africa. He's gone to China, of course. Done interviews in the U.S. You'll see from some of my questions and his answers how much work he's done. One thing I did want to mention, though, I was at a conference on Chinese film at the University of Idaho, in Moscow, Idaho, put on by the Confucius Institute there. And most of the participants were conference participants giving papers. I was giving a keynote lecture. And there was Erich in the audience at the University of Idaho in Moscow. That's the kind of legwork he did for this. So it's a very impressive book. I've really enjoyed reading it and learned a lot.
Oh, well, thank you, Stan. I mean, I have to say that is one rule of journalism, is you just show up over and over and over again. And there are few people whose work informed this book more than Stan. So it's a thrill to be here with him and also with the Asia Society. So thank you so much.
Reminds me of the 50s song, Mutual Admiration Society, but okay. Yeah. Well, I've got some questions, and let me start with the first one. The book really begins by saying, I'm going to bookend this with Top Gun 1 and Top Gun 2, Top Gun Maverick, 1986, 2019. But a lot's happened since 2019, and even with Top Gun, from Tom Cruise's jacket and those changes and a lot of other things. So I'm not saying at all the book doesn't stand up. It does. And I think what's happened afterwards confirms what you wrote. But maybe you can say something about what happened after 2019 that may or may not have affected your views that come out in the book.
Sure. This is why I'm very excited to have an afterword in the paperback coming out next year, because this book came out in February, and it feels like so much has changed even since then. When it comes to Hollywood-China relations. And Stan's right. Early in the book, I say we could try to think about this as the story of what happened between Top Gun 1 and Top Gun 2, because the original Top Gun is something of a perfect marriage of entertainment and government support, government philosophy, right? We have a movie that not only allowed recruitments to surge, but Ray-Ban sales to surge. I mean, that is some kind of impressive feat. And then, of course, many in the room will remember that when the trailer for the new Top Gun was coming out, it was very clear that they had edited out the Taiwanese and the Japanese flags from Tom Cruise's jacket. And I think for many people, it was like, wow, the Chinese influence in Hollywood is such that even a movie as inherently patriotic as Top Gun is not immune to this. And it became, as many of you remember, it became a real cause, especially in conservative media. And the studio took a lot of flack for it. Of course, the movie itself was then delayed several times. It's only come out this past summer. And I think your question alludes to what has changed in those 3 years, which is that it's become more of a political liability in the U.S., I think, to acquiesce to Chinese censors than is worth it for a lot of studios. Because when the movie came out, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the film, you may not have watched For the Jacket as closely as I did. I felt like I couldn't blink every time it was on screen. And it is only on screen for the briefest of seconds. But they did restore the Taiwanese and the Japanese flag. Now, interestingly, they knew by that point that the chances of any Chinese release were over, right? There was no way that the Chinese officials were going to allow a movie like Top Gun Maverick to be released in their theaters. What was interesting, and what I reported more recently, was that Tencent, the massive Chinese tech conglomerate, had invested in the new Top Gun film. And I remember I went to the Shanghai Film Festival in 2019, and I attended one of those big, I mean, if anyone here has been to them, I'm sure, like one of these big, huge dog and pony shows that Tencent was having, announcing their slate for the upcoming couple of years. And I remember they announced that they were investing in Top Gun Maverick at that event. And I thought, well, that is a very bold choice. I mean, that is not exactly the movie you would think Tencent was going to run into. And it turns out that as U.S.-China relations started to really fray, Tencent executives also determined we don't want to be anywhere near this, and they actually very quietly dropped out of the film, and they no longer have that investment in the movie, which is, I mean, now that the movie has done so well, has cost them some, considerable revenue. But I think it speaks to how executives in both countries now realize I might get more heat at home than I would have even just 2 years ago. And I have to worry more about that than maintaining the market access.
Very good. One of the many fascinating things I found in the book was, whereas you talk about a lot of things that have been talked about previously, the ban on the 3 Hollywood studios in 1997, the classic Red Dawn case, where the villains were shifted from China to North Korea, but you go into it in much more depth than has been done previously, particularly your interviews with custom film effects people. Yeah. I've never seen that anywhere else. And even the stuff, what I've written about the 1997 ban, but you have much more detail than I was able to find out. So I'd be interested in how you went about investigating things for this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think I work at the Wall Street Journal, and so I have been trained in daily journalism, but one thing that is amazing about writing a book is that you can often return to events long after they've happened and find people much more willing to talk about them than if you were trying to cover them in real time. And so when it comes to the 1997 bans, this would be on Disney for releasing Kundun, Sony for releasing 7 Years in Tibet, and MGM for releasing Red Corner, thank you. I almost called it Red Carpet, but that's my book, not the Richard Gere movie. And obviously those are hugely sensitive, fraught situations when they're happening, and it's going to be impossible to get anyone to talk to you about them. So basically, when I was working on those more historical chapters, the first thing I would do would go to a service called Factiva, which functions as kind of like a LexisNexis, and I would go back and I would just read a ton of coverage from the time, and usually in that coverage you can try to find names of people who were working on it at the moment. And then it's a matter of just trying to suss out who's the best character here, because oftentimes the best character in that situation is not Michael Eisner, the CEO of Disney. The best character is actually Peter Murphy, the executive who worked for Michael Eisner, who was sent to manage the situation, right? Like, you want someone who's going to be more directly involved, not necessarily the highest ranking person involved in the story. And because it's now, more than 20 years later, Peter doesn't work at Disney anymore. He's willing to sit down and talk about it. Now Red Dawn was more difficult because Red Dawn was one of those situations where, for those who don't know, we know the original Red Dawn from the 1980s is about a group of American teenagers who have to heroically fend off a Soviet invasion of their hometown. And MGM in 2009 remade the film, but with China as the invader, not Russia or Al-Qaeda or any other potential villain. And when the Chinese officials found out about this, they caused such a stink that MGM had to ship the finished film to a special effects studio and change the completed film so that it was not about a Chinese invasion, but a North Korean invasion. And what's interesting is, when I was starting to write this book, a lot of people, I think, had recency bias, and they would expect me to, they thought I'd be focused a lot on movies like The Great Wall, the Matt Damon co-production and things like that. Because at the time, those were big moments in the China-Hollywood relationship. But you realize, in retrospect, there's not a lot to mine there, right? What is there to say about The Great Wall other than that taught us what we already knew, which is that movies rarely work in both countries right now. Red Dawn, however, struck me as a hugely consequential moment because it was the last major studio film put into production with China as the villain. And it also was a case study where everyone learned the lesson, right? Everybody learned you don't cast China as the bad guy if you want to maintain that market access. So as a storyteller, you think, well, what's the best way to tell this story? And I thought, well, let's try to find the special effects workers who go to work one day and suddenly find themselves thrust in an international incident. As Stan said, it was a firm that very, very difficultly was not credited in the film. And so it was a matter of calling people who did work on special effects in the film, asking if they knew what firm had done this special last-minute work. And then once I got that name, I actually found a defunct Facebook page that had some photos from the office that people had uploaded. And then from there, I got the name of someone who had worked there. And I called him. He was a bus driver in Oregon now, and said, hey, I'd like to talk to you about this time that you were working on Red Dawn. He gave me names of more workers, and I went from there. But it is one of those, I mean, there's no easy way to call someone and say, you don't know me, I'm writing a book, and I want to talk to you about something that happened 15 years ago. But one of the beautiful things is that people are far more willing to talk about experience than you might assume.
Okay, great. Another question. I think it's chapter 11. You talk about Hollywood's translators in China.
Yeah.
Rennie Harlin plays a big role. Of course, the Russo brothers had a major influence on Wolf Warrior 2, which was one of now #2 box office hit of all time in China after Lake Changjin. Are these people still relevant now, given what's going on with the two markets?
Less and less so, I think. You know, this was a moment in 2015, 2016 when a lot of Hollywood talent was being hired to go to China and teach Chinese producers how to make movies the Hollywood way. And as Stan said, I spent time with Rennie Harlin, who was there, frankly, because he couldn't get work in the U.S. He was kind of sent to director's jail after he directed a huge flop in the 90s. When I met him in China in 2017, he was the happiest man alive because he was on China's A-list. And what was interesting was I had this plan when I started the book to go back and spend more time with Rennie. But then COVID hit, and I couldn't find him for a while. And it turns out he was in Sweden, where they hadn't shut down production, making a movie there. So I thought, oh, this clearly tells you everything you need to know, right? This is just someone who will just go to where he can make a movie, right? He's just sort of like a shark always moving, right? But it's in just to whatever country he can be working in. And I don't know if he's back in China or if he's gone back to China, but I think you're right. I think that moment has passed. And if you look at the Chinese box office today, it's pretty clear that there's very little need for Western talent anymore. I think that the Chinese filmmakers have absorbed a lot of those lessons. I think where we might see it is the last trip I took to China was in January of 2020. In retrospect, an insane time to have been traveling back and forth. But I went to Qingdao, where a lot of you know Wanda had built these massive sound stages. And I visited the set of a movie that is still not out, the Fengshen trilogy.
Yeah, that's my next question.
Yeah, that they're calling China's Lord of the Rings. That set was interesting because it was this massive Chinese production, but you could tell that there were a number of more experienced Westerners in below-the-line categories. Right. Stunt workers, horse trainers, that kind of work still seemed to be outsourced to a degree.
Okay. Well, you anticipated my next question on Fengshen Trilogy, which is coming out. The first one is coming out this year, so that would be.
I've heard that before.
Well, it's listed anyway, so we'll see. So let me skip that question and move on to another one. Again, one of the fascinating chapters of the book deals with your time in Kenya, in Africa, because it's a soft power issue between China and the U.S., a lot of kind of contention between the two countries. And we always read about all these favorability ratings where China's at the bottom in North America, Japan, South Korea, Western Europe. but seldom read about their successes in places like Africa. So maybe you could talk about your experience there.
Yeah, this was inspired by a couple things. One was when I started writing this book, a number of Hollywood executives, I think rather defensively, would tell me that China's efforts in entertainment would never succeed because Americans would never go see Chinese films, which is a pretty myopic way of viewing the world. And I remember when I learned of the Belt and Road Initiative, I thought, I wonder if there is a cultural component to all of the bridges, tunnels, roads, railways, hospitals we hear about being built through this initiative. And it turns out that there's quite a robust one. And in fact, if you spend a few months reading Chinese state media, you'll very quickly see that co-production treaties very often follow trade investments, and that oftentimes alliances forming off-screen will be reflected in movies on-screen. For instance, the Wandering Earth, which is another giant Chinese blockbuster from a few years ago, which is about a group of Chinese astronauts saving the Earth. The only other nationality reflected in the heroic spaceship is Russian, and so it became this sort of mirror imaging of the political reality that was forming, and then it becomes a question of, okay, so how do you tell this story most effectively? And that's when I learned about the 10,000 Villages Project, which is a project based out of Beijing with a Chinese company called Star Times to distribute Chinese-built low-cost satellite dishes to 10,000 African villages that are already receiving more traditional Belt and Road investments. Just sort of peeling the curtain back a little bit, I went to Kenya because it was a country not far from the shadow of colonialism, and I thought that there could be some interesting parallels to mine there. It was also a country with significant Belt and Road investment, and it was also a country where a lot of people spoke English. So there was an ease of use there that I might not have found if I'd gone to some other African countries. And what I found there was pretty fascinating, because you drive through these small, remote Kenyan villages, and you'd look for these satellite dishes atop roofs that were tic-tac orange. And you'd go inside, and it was not uncommon to see people watching Chinese soap operas, watching Chinese kung fu. I met a 4-year-old Kenyan boy who pretended to be the Monkey King with his sisters. It was certainly a cultural introduction that I thought was happening largely out of sight. But it was more complicated than that, because it wasn't as though there had been a wholesale replacement of Western entertainment or Kenyan entertainment in favor of the Chinese entertainment too. It was more complicated than that. But where it wasn't complicated was when I met with Kenyan officials who were very blunt in telling me that they wanted to politically align themselves with China and move away from the West. And I met with the Kenyan film minister, who was an incredibly socially conservative man, and he told me, I love importing Chinese movies because they've already been censored, and I don't have to worry about your Western values seeping into my culture. And so sometimes I think this may not be an even playing field. In some of these countries, it may not be that the viewers have much of a choice in terms of what kinds of entertainment they might be seeing. And just a little footnote, I'm actually returning to Kenya in 3 weeks to take copies of the book to everyone I interviewed there, and I'm very curious to see how the intervening two and a half years have affected their views of China and the West.
Great. I have just one quick comment on what you said about Wandering Earth, because I'm a big fan of Liu Cixin, who wrote the novella, and I've read his 3-volume trilogy. And 1,500 pages, fascinating. But The Wandering Earth, the novel, the 48-page novella, is so much better than the film, and so much more cynical. There are no countries at all in the novel, and they completely fabricated a film from a novella which is critical of everybody including government officials, public opinion, religion. I can't even say what he says about religion. Maybe I can. I don't know if I can use scatological language. But he said nobody believes in religion anymore because this is when the earth is going to be destroyed. Because if God existed, he'd be a real bastard. He's very cynical about everything. And you don't get anything like that, his voice in the film. So I wanted to throw that in for anybody interested in literature. Okay. I am a professor, after all.
Right,
okay.
yeah.
So,
I didn't know that, actually. I had not read the source material.
okay. Well, I think you'd enjoy it. I've read a lot of his short stories and novels and everything else. So my next question, you mentioned Tencent and Top Gun. Tencent pulling out. And I was wondering, in reading your book, what the crackdown that's taking place on these private entrepreneurs like Jack Ma and Alibaba and Wang Jianlin and Wanda and Tencent and, Pony Ma and all these people, how, since a lot of these companies were investing in Hollywood and even wanting to buy studios in Hollywood, how does that affect the Hollywood-China relationship?
I mean, I think those days are over. I don't see any Chinese financing behind the scenes right now, and I don't see it coming anytime soon. And when I went to Qingdao, I said Wanda had built that massive soundstage facility, but they didn't own it when I visited. They had to sell it off to Sumac. And when you walk the deserted streets, it's very common to still see the faded lettering spelling out Wanda over certain signs and things. And it's interesting. The Journal just reported today that Jack Ma is planning to step down. And in many ways, it feels like that Wanda example was a bit of a canary in the coal mine for what happens when these companies, in the eyes of some, grow too big or too powerful. But it always seemed like, the Chinese market opportunity was coming in two ways. There was the box office, there were the ticket sales, and then there was the money that was starting to flow behind the scenes. And really, I think we remember, because it was so potent, there was like this moment where everyone had a for sale sign outside their door, and it seemed like everywhere you looked there was some Chinese billionaire in Beverly Hills trying to buy a company. My favorite example in the book is of a smelting company that came to try and buy a production firm that had produced Dallas Buyers Club. And obviously the production company thought they were going to get rich, but they had no idea why this company, this zinc company, wanted them in their portfolio. But it seems like those days are over, if not because of skepticism in China, but I think when I talk to a lot of folks in Hollywood, there's just a real reluctance to enter into something that uncertain. I think you still see, when you go to the movies, you'll still see credits that may include things like, I think Perfect World is still financing some movies as part of a pre-existing deal. But the days of Alibaba announcing a couple picture deal with Paramount or something like that feel like they're very far away.
And I guess they're closing their Pasadena office.
Oh, are they really?
I don't know if they are. I maybe not, but they're certainly not as active.
No, I've been meaning to check in, actually, because it's been very quiet.
I was there for the opening, soft opening, but because I have friends working there. But I don't know what they're doing right now, Alibaba. Yeah, that suggests a question to me, what you just said. At this point in time, what does Hollywood now want from China? What does China want from Hollywood?
Well, I think the easier question to answer is, what does Hollywood want from China? Because over the past 6 months to a year, we've had a number of high-profile examples of major Hollywood movies not being allowed to screen in Chinese theaters. Marvel has had exceptionally bad luck. Number of their films, including Shang-Chi, and The Eternals, directed by Chloe Zhao. More recently, I think Thor has not gotten in. There's been a number of movies that have not gotten in. Doctor Strange, that would have Black Widow. In another moment, those would have flown onto Chinese screens and pretty easily made $300 or $400 million.
Spider-Man is another good example.
Great example. Spider-Man too, and there's been this kind of narrative that, well, Spider-Man made I'm going to make this number up. It's somewhere around like $1.7 billion worldwide without China. So who needs China? I think that's a little naive. I think 1.7 is great. I think Sony would still have preferred 1.9 if it were possible. And I don't think necessarily that uncertain market access necessarily means that there's not going to be any concern for maintaining some access. Some movies are still getting into China and making money there, to say nothing of the larger corporate interests that all of the studios have. This was a major theme that emerged during the book, was that the book primarily covers 1994 to the present day, and even in just that short amount of time, the parent companies housing the studios got bigger and more complicated. And so suddenly, if you're working at Universal and you're putting together a movie, even if you don't think the movie even if you think the movie is going to be rejected by Chinese officials, you still have to worry about alienating officials who might affect your theme park operations, or affect another part of the NBC Universal family, or even a part of the Comcast family. I don't necessarily think that we're in an era of where the concerns of Beijing are no longer being discussed or at least considered at the studios. Now, what does China want from Hollywood? That's a more complicated question, because I think a simple answer would be that the Chinese box office, certainly it seems, doesn't need Hollywood to the degree it once did. As Stan said, we've got movies now making $700, $800 million at the Chinese box office on their own. It will be curious to see, though. I think one thing to watch is that Chinese theater owners often can exert quite a bit of pressure, though, and I think they don't love a world where they're not showing Marvel movies, because those are a lot of ticket sales. That's a lot of popcorn that they're not selling attached to those films too. So I wonder if we'll start to see more of a free flow. But right now, I mean, it's never been more opaque, and I think in some corners of Hollywood there's frustration that it feels like they've almost been played.
Yeah. Of course, Jurassic World has made over 150 million in China, and it's still going. Made 2 million last weekend and 2 million the weekend before. Still the top hit there in many ways. So there's still more. And Avatar 2 is coming out, and James Cameron is loved in China. So that's going to be another canary in the coal mine.
Well, the original Avatar, when it was released in 2009, was essentially the movie that caused Hollywood to wake up to China's box office potential, because it made more than $200 million there at a time when that was almost considered a mathematical impossibility.
And you go back to Titanic,
yeah,
which was amazing when it came out in 1998. For many years, that was the biggest hit in China.
Yeah, I interviewed a guy who's around my age, and the first American movie he ever saw on the big screen was Titanic. Can you imagine that being your introduction to American storytelling? I mean, it's just kind of he described it as this just sort of awe-inspiring experience. And he's, as you said, he's now in his mid-30s. He's going to be someone who's going to have that kind of loyalty to James Cameron. Yeah,
and people went back to see that film many times. In response to one of the things you said in terms of what China wants from Hollywood, I would add one thing. I've always argued that China needs Hollywood for two basic reasons. One, the main reason, which still exists, and that's the one I would focus on, is that they want to be the largest box office market in the world. They've lost that now. They gained it because of COVID, and then lost it because of COVID. They need the Hollywood product for that. Mm-hmm. The second thing that China always wanted, which now they have, was to make sure they have at least 50 or 60% of their market for their own domestic films. That's not a problem anymore. But being a larger box office market than North America is something they really are concerned about. So I think that's another factor, perhaps. Where do you think the two markets will end the year? Well, the speculation has been that no question that North America will end the year on top. Maybe what, 7.5 billion versus 4.6 billion or something. I'm remembering some things I've read. So
but
at my age, memory is not always the best.
But a sizable gap.
A sizable gap. Yeah, nobody is giving China much of a chance this year because of the shutdowns in Shanghai and Shenzhen and those major markets and the lack of Hollywood product, for example. Now, there will be a lot of big Chinese films coming out around October 1st, of course, as there always are, and the end of the year. But remains to be seen what's going on with the various Omicron variants at that time. I want to make sure I leave enough time. What time is it now? I want to leave enough time for questions. I don't have my phone on.
About 5 after 6.
5 to 6. Okay, we have a little bit of time then. Let me ask you another. Yeah. No, let me just add another question because I want to leave time for questions. But let me ask maybe one more question. I'm sure there'll be a lot of other questions coming up. Intellectual property, IP. You give a very fascinating case of Warner Brothers, Wanda on theater development in China. And Warner Brothers pulling out, I guess, when they realized they couldn't have more than 49% of ownership. And then Wanda using what they learned from Warner Brothers to simply develop their own film theaters. So could you talk a little about IP and what Hollywood has actually lost from all this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the Warner Brothers example that he cites is in the mid-90s. There was an effort at Warner Brothers to seed a better movie-going experience in China. The studio had done this before. I was fascinated to learn about this, where they would go and build better, sophisticated, air-conditioned theaters in struggling markets to try and encourage competition. And then once they had competition, all theaters would get better, more tickets would be sold, and suddenly they'd have a better international market there. And they did this in China, but obviously, as many of you know, you can't do that kind of thing in China without a local partner. And so they partnered with Wanda and started to develop these theaters, sharing information on, foot traffic and foot traffic patterns and the ratio of the screen to the seats and so on. And then one day got a call that this would no longer be a partnership. And as with most things in China, it was unclear if this was a Wanda decision, a Beijing decision, if it was because of the ownership structure or something else. If it was because of the movies they were worried were going to get programmed. It's the classic kind of decision without any real concrete reasons or answers. And Warner Brothers eventually just had to back out of the project. Now, one executive I spoke to said, well, they still kind of got what they wanted, which was the ultimate goal was to try to encourage China to build better theaters, and that was still going to happen. But I have to say, it's so funny you bring this up because this deal just came up in conversation 2 weeks ago with someone I didn't even interview for the book, and this person was still burned about sort of what he characterized as kind of the brazen theft and sort of bad practices that they saw there. But as with most things, and as with so many decisions being made in tech and cars and fashion, it was still a market too big to walk away from. It was a market you really couldn't stay angry at for long.
IMAX faced that same problem with former employees building their own IMAX-type theaters, but they seem to have solved that issue.
Yeah, no, IMAX is a fascinating case. I mean, you could make the argument that they have been more successful at navigating this, walking this tightrope than any other firm. And interestingly, you're right, they did have intellectual property problems. In fact, one of the things that was on the cutting room floor of this book that really pained me were stories of IMAX employees microwaving hard drives when the FBI showed up and trying to destroy all the evidence of the IP theft. But what's interesting is IMAX has straddled it quite well, in part because they became a very Chinese company. They moved headquarters from Singapore to China. They began screening Chinese films even more than they screen Western films in the market. And they have managed to, it seems, operate pretty comfortably. Now, I think they also would like to see more Western films flowing into China right now. But they're maintaining operations better than most.